The global economy is at a historic crossroads. The rules-based trading system that once underpinned globalization is crumbling, replaced by a power-driven order where sanctions, tariffs, subsidies, and control over critical resources have been tools for coercion. Today, we're here to talk about whether this fractured landscape harden into rival blocs or evolve into a fluid multipolar order. And perhaps most importantly, whether emerging economies seize the moment to shape the rules of tomorrow. Hello, and welcome to another episode of your trusted podcast on international relations and geopolitics. I'm Valeria, turning in live from New York City, and I'm joined today by my co-host Fabio, straight from Brussels. Hey Fabio, how's it going today?
Hi, Valeria. All good. Thanks a lot. Coming back from the reality from a slow summer. Those that know here in Brussels and in Europe, the summer is quite relaxed. So, well, at least on the work front, things are getting more busy. And of course, the geopolitical landscape has certainly not giving us a slow moments during the summer. And I feel today's conversation will be super interesting, delving into the world of economics and how Trump's return that feels like it's been there for forever is shifting a lot of things. And I think that at the center of today's conversation, we're going to talk about India, a global power that's balancing relations among powers. And I think that our guest will really help us to see India's role in the world today. And we're particularly excited about today's discussion because we're welcoming Yash Kalash, a senior fellow from the detailed economy topics at CG. He's tuning in from Delhi, straight from India, and he's representing the Geostrata as well, which is an independent policy and research think tank from India. And it's an interesting association that delves into topics of international scope with a particular Indian perspective on these world affairs. So, Yash, it's a pleasure to have you with us. How are you today?
I'm good, Fabio, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Valeria, as well. I'm very happy to be here and talk about quite a few important topics that have been, challenging us and challenging me in my work every day to think about how this world is functioning and how things are changing at light speed, with things happening every day and hard to keep up, actually. But happy to be here.
Josh, it's so great to have you on the podcast. I think we're all going to learn so much from you today. It's also fantastic to bring together these three voices representing different regions of the world. Fabio from Latin America, living in Brussels, me from Spain, based in the US, and then Josh, who is joining us from India today. I mean, that's fitting because the episode is going to dive into that global story and the reordering of the world economy and the rise of power-driven order. So what a better team to do that.
No, indeed, Valeria. I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. And just before we get ahead into the topics we'll touch, if there's anyone interested in these sorts of associations and opportunities, I must say that Geostrata has really interesting conferences and seminars, both online and in India. So really, we'll put all those links in the description of the podcast for anyone interested in following their pages. I must also give a little bit of promotion to Young Professionals in Foreign Policy, which is as well our organization with branches all over the world, here in Brussels, in London. There's some in the US as well, Valeria, there in New York City, in Washington, in San Francisco, and Toronto as well. There's a branch in Tokyo as well. So if there's anyone interested in participating in events, getting close to those foreign affairs seniors and getting those young voices there where the action takes place, make sure to check it out. So who knows, Valeria, maybe you will even stop in one of those events in New York in the coming weeks.
I would absolutely love that. Well, with that, I think we can move into the structure of the podcast. We have, per usual, three main blocks. The first will be about the transition from multilateralism and norms to power and coercion. Next, we will talk about how different global actors are adjusting to this new era of economic weaponization. And then finally, we will look at the world ahead and ask whether it will be a multipolar or more fragmented world order. And with that, I think we can dive into the first block. We're living in a moment where economics and geopolitics have blended. Tariffs, sanctions, subsidies, these are no longer technical instruments of policy as they were once. They are the weapons of a new kind of competition. This is what some call the weaponization of the global economy. Some economic analysts say that the global economy has entered a post-American phase. The US once was a guarantor of public goods like secure navigation, trade rules, and the stability of the dollar, but this has now shifted into a new role: less global insurer, more unilateral structured profit. That shift has fractured the rules-based system and accelerated the use of economics as a tool of power. So, Josh, from your perspective, how do you see this shift away from a rules-based system? Is the global economy really moving from norms and cooperation toward raw power and coercion? Or are we simply seeing that some rule setting is dispersing beyond the traditional powers that used to engage in it?
Well, it's a really good question, Valeria. I think the challenge that we're seeing right now is that we are, in a short answer, yes, moving away from the world of norms and structures that were created, especially after the Bretton Woods system came into being. What we are living in a world, at least in my perspective, is a world of leverage, where big powers are leveraging their positions, their critical mass or critical areas of comparative advantage for their own benefit. And there's a role for middle powers and smaller powers to kind of leverage those coalitions and get some benefits out of that, right? So I think we are moving away from that Bretton Woods system of, multilateral institutions setting out norms for globalization. As Francis Fukuyama once said in the 1990s, that this was the end of the world, right? Like after the fall of the Soviet Union, and this would be the system of governance set by the United States. But there are challengers coming up. The BRICS are at the center of all of that. BRICS, I mean Brazil, Russia, India, China, and each have their own interests, each have their own degree of leverage that they can use. And where we see a lot of challenges coming up is in the world of digitization. So the economy of the world that we had prior to, let's say, the early 2000s was fundamentally very different to the economy that we see today. Today, it's centered around technology companies, supply chains, critical minerals, which are being leveraged for things like AI and quantum technologies. And these are the critical areas where nations will have a comparative advantage and be able to define their economies for the future. And what we see today is nations fundamentally coming to create structures that allow them to create that comparative advantage in that particular area. So that is where we are. It's a fluid order. It's highly fragmented. No two nations are going to see eye to eye on any or all topics, but it's about cooperation in moments of time where they can leverage one another. So I think that's the world we're living in, and it's I think the way I would see it is countries no longer are asking which bloc do I belong to. Instead, they ask which coalition can help me leverage the most that I can get out of, right? And that's the world we're living in today.
Yeah, it's a really interesting take, Yash. I think that you hit the nail how to introduce this topic. Before we used to see more rigid ideological blocks, really defined. Back in the Cold War, it was clear the world was divided in two spheres of influence, in two economic spheres, which is no longer the case. I think that we've seen completely how even the most trusted geopolitical allies are having commercial and trade tensions among each other, right? Here in Brussels, I mean, you would never have thought that the transatlantic relation would be in the situation that it's currently at. And that totally calls upon countries such as the ones you've said, the BRICS, which have always been there a little bit in the middle. And you've got the bigger, those two huge couple powers, one in Asia, one in the American continent, trying to pull them to its own sphere of influence, and these countries navigating there and maybe deciding even not to be in either of those. And leverage, I think it's the word to talk about these days. And to me, another interesting concept, it's economic choke points. I mean, throughout history, we've seen how oil and gas, now finance and tech are those economic choke points that these different economic giants are trying to use in order to restrict others or to have leverage on others. And the U.S. has pioneered throughout the latest decades through sanctions, export controls, and even surveillance of global internet and commercial platforms. And now we are seeing how other countries, other economies are catching up, trying to build parallel systems also, not to be, a victim in these complicated economic weaponized interdependence. So yeah, no, I couldn't agree. That's the best way to introduce today's topic. And a question that I would like to ask both of you, it's do you think that these different tools of economic cohesion have been effective to change the way countries behave, or do you think that it's just allowing countries to adapt and move to different alternatives?
Maybe I'll take that first. And I think where we are right now is, countries have realized that, what is strategic and what is non-strategic as part of their economy. This definition is not so black and white anymore, right? Our critical infrastructure, from our energy grids to our technology platforms to social media, right, to the visual platforms and telephones that we use, these are all critical in nature. And the more the world gets fragmented, the more, there's fears of supply chains and where that technology is made and how it's getting surveilled. And, when a country can put a sanction on you to not be able to, get a particular technology or a fundamental element that you need to build that technology in your country, right? So I think, given that scenario, most nations are realizing that it's fundamental to have sovereign capability over your technology ecosystem, which is central to your productivity, which is obviously central to your economic growth. And protecting that environment is very important. So if you see, for example, the journey of India here, you'll see that there's a strategic angle to this. India started its journey on the digital public infrastructure point of view a long time ago, and it was more about, financial inclusion, social empowerment, growing our economy, getting those who were underbanked, underserved into the formalized economy and opening up, their growth and lifting people out of poverty. With time, those technologies are being seen as critical, right? You've seen the kind of sanctions that the United States put on Russia right after the Ukrainian invasion on taking it out of the SWIFT system, for example, not allowing it access to global finance or payments. That made a lot of nations scared and made them realize that they need to have control over for example, their payment grids. And these are critical for their economic growth. So the term I use is the securitization of what was once civilian is now becoming part of the strategic architecture of governance and geopolitics today. So I think this is going to get more and more entrenched in time as technologies become more important.
Josh, I mean, I don't have much to add to that question. That was such an interesting point about how what one was a problem is now being leveraged as opportunities and strategic advantages. I guess I have another question to follow up on that since we're talking about coercion. Obviously, we have seen the rolling of different tariffs from the US and then the adaptation and backtracking and negotiations on them to the point where that coercion no longer signals any sort of certainty because you have I mean, is the theory of carrots and sticks. When you have that type of coercion but then you don't live up to it, is it really coercion, or are we just talking about something that you're saying but doesn't mean anything? So in that sense, I want to ask you about how you see that form of coercion when we're seeing the US backtrack from it one time and time again.
This is like, there are two factors to this, right? So one is the angle of sanctions, right? So sanctions and tariffs rarely ever work. We've never seen them fundamentally change the way, international relations takes place. Now, for example, let's see, the sanctions put on, for example, on India recently was supposed to deter India from, engaging with Russia. It didn't. It pushed India closer to buying even more Russian oil. You saw Prime Minister Modi at the SCO meeting with, the bonhomie between him, Putin, and Xi Jinping was evident for the world to see. And what that tells you is that, in this world in this multipolar world where you have options, nations are going to use their strategic calculation to get the best out of, different partnerships, different engagements, even though they may not see eye to eye on everything, right? And central to all of that is the notion of Trump himself, right? This character, the president of the United States. So I think what he has done since he's come into power is fractured the global system even more, made differences that were underlying currents. I would say, for example, the India-US relationship, it was always, fiction driven. It was never a frictionless relationship. It's made it more evident for growing economies, emerging economies, realizing that US is not the only partner that they can look at, and it's not going to be a guarantor of their security, which is more and more evident in Europe, for example, with the thinking there, and that you need to have diversified partners in this world. And agency is wisdom, right? The more leverage you have, the more opportunity you have to sort of you know have a diversified portfolio of players that you can engage with at times of difficulty, so you're not um, being attacked by a central player like the United States has been used to in the past. So I think that's where it is. If I just touch on a little bit on the India situation, I think given where in this environment with all the sanctions and all the tariffs and the sort of language that's come out of the United States, it's really put a lot of folks in India questioning the sort of integration that India was trying to achieve, after the civil nuclear deal that was signed about a decade ago. The rise of the Quad and things like this, it's put a lot of that into question. And you can see that, right? It's not just economic. There's things in defense, for example. India was supposed to buy critical, fighter jets from the United States, F-35s particularly. That they were on the table as part of an economic package deal between the two nations. That's been put aside. For example, the S-400 missile systems that were part of the strategic engagement between Russia and India, they're being continued, right? And there's talks about developing your own systems, but also purchasing others from Russia and other partners around the world. So what you're seeing is that there is a clear fragmentation, both on the structural sanction level, but also on the personal relationship between leaders like Trump and others. And there is, I think, a lack of realization in the United States or in the Trump administration, particularly, that these sort of aggressive tones are not going to be received well from other leaders and other societies, especially societies like India and China, which are thousands and thousand-year-old civilizations who don't really want to be told what to do. Again, so that's part of that
Yeah,
process.
no, I couldn't agree more that the rhetorics and the art of how you talk about these issues is crucial. I mean, I don't think that Trump completely changed the fact that the economies were drifting apart. That's a tendency I think we've seen for the past couple decades. Maybe now the speed of this fragmentation has intensified it. But what I find is so interesting about this particular character is the way that he talks about this economic agenda, right? Like this economic nationalism. I mean, if there's a country that has benefited from globalization, it is the United States. I mean, the global economy is based on its coin, the dollar. So if the U.S. Steps away from that, I mean, if the base of this pyramid falls, the whole thing is going to crumble down. And I really like your point about the security of your supply chains, of things that used to be only for civilian terms, and now they're part of this national security agenda as well. And I think it's interesting how all these things are merging into one. It's not just economics, it's not just national defense, but it's overlapping. And I think that's as well a tendency we are seeing. And Valeria, maybe this is a little bridge to you as you're based in the U.S., but and maybe you know how people are taking this, because maybe in Trump's campaign, this tariff talk could have been popular. Maybe it's not as much now that that the Americans are realizing that in order to impose these sort of tariffs and these economic coercions, it is at the end your own people, your own customers in your market that will suffer a bit the consequences. I mean, at the end, a tariff, it's a tax on your customers. So there is this really interesting article I was reading last week about how Trump's trade war might be a losing battle for everyone. Maybe in the short term, politically wise, you get a couple wins here and there. Maybe some industries will come back, but long term, it's mostly going to hurt the United States advanced industries. It's mostly as well going to lose foreign customers. It's starting to encourage young people and researchers, innovators to move into the U.S. So maybe long term, this sort of thinking might not be even that beneficial for the American population. But I don't know, Valeria, how do you see this perspective, or how do you feel that Americans are seeing this economic talk recently?
I mean, experts certainly agree on that. They've been warning since the campaign about the effects that these would have on the economy long term and on the role of the US globally. But that is a different perspective than what Trump's base has. And I mean, we've talked many times about how we're in the post-truth era. We are in a current place where any sort of criticism or warning of what tariffs are going to do to the US economy is dismissed as just criticism from the opposition that has no base. And the administration has made sure to surround themselves by so-called economic experts that defend the idea that standing up and putting more tariffs in place is going to make U.S. domestic businesses boom all of a sudden. So it's two different dynamics, right? Like we're seeing the long-term analysis by experts, and then we're seeing the Trump administration simply deny that. And I do think that to a lot of people in the base, the way they see this is not necessarily that they think the tariffs are going to make the economy boom, but they see it as a sort of signaling and positioning of the U.S. as a strong power. And that's what they want to see. They want to see that the U.S. stands up for themselves and that they say, you're no longer going to take advantage of me. I think that is where they see the advantage of these, rather than actually believing that the tariff was long-term and going to be a huge improvement for the U.S. economy.
Sure. I'll just add one point here. I think just to build on what Valeria said, the one thing that we're seeing, within the G7, I had the opportunity of being part of the G7 process this summer, under the Canadian presidency. So one of the things that I did was part of the think tank that I am. I was able to lead a task force called the Digitization of the Global Economy, and part of that task force, one of the layers of work that we did on, and the G7 countries are at the center of all of this, is the question of productivity for an economy, right? And economists are obsessed with the term productivity because it's all about how much growth you can extract from your existing industries, your services, your population. And the real factor here is that economic productivity has declined in most advanced economies due to various different factors. Some factors being demographics, other factors around traditional industries just not being as competitive on cost. That's where China, for example, has taken quite a lot of advantage over other countries by selling cheaper products, right? So if you look at that, the advantage that a country like the United States has is it's in its high-tech technology. But where does the high-tech technology sector get most of its brain power from? It's the H-1B visa, right? And most of that is people coming from Asia, from Europe, who migrate to the United States. They're the PhDs, they're the ones creating those companies in Silicon Valley, etc. And one thing that the question that I always ask is that the Trump administration has been heavy-handed on immigration, and H-1B visas have, today there was a news on, recently about H-1B visas becoming a lot more expensive to give out, and that will reduce the brain, the brain soaking of really talented people from around the world who come into the United States to create innovation and drive productivity and drive economic growth. And I think that's something that they're not understanding, the economists in the United States, at least those who are in the administration right now, which is that actually sanctions are, one part of the problem. Yes, your domestic production needs to increase. But the second part is your productivity of your technology sector is going to decrease with this immigration heavy-handedness that you have on your policy, and actually make you more uncompetitive, if anything else, against other developing and emerging economies. So something for American policymakers to think about.
That is such a good point, Josh. Just for context, the price increase has been $100,000 fees just to apply. The H-1B visas already had to go through a lottery where I don't know the exact numbers for every year, but only around half of them would get them because there was more demand than there was available visas. And now that adds $100,000 just to apply for it. So that definitely is going to affect productivity, as you say. And you cannot talk about boosting certain business areas when you are decreasing the talent pool that goes into. And it's something that I'm personally in an H-1B visa, so that's certainly something that is concerning to a lot of the people that came to the U.S. to work and in particular adding to the tech industry. Well, with that, then I think we can move to the next block where we will be talking about how emerging economies from Greeks to others are adapting and trying to shape this new reality. If the first part of our conversation looked at the fracturing of the system, the second is about what the responses are. Around the world, countries are finding new ways to adapt, some by building their own institutions, others by deepening regional cooperation, and many by reducing dependence on the United States. We see China pushing alternative institutions like BRICS, the AIIB, and SEO, the EU caught between defending the rules and adapting to coercion, Brazil positioning itself as a global South leader, and India, perhaps the most interesting, emerging as a hinge power between the West and South. Josh, when we look at the expanded BRICS, currency swap agreements, and alternative institutions, are we witnessing the birth of a parallel economic order?
Yeah, I think we're not completely there yet. We're not at a fully parallel order yet, but the momentum is definitely moving away from US centrality in the global economy. And the BRICS are, of course, the driving power, and more so than anything symbolic in the sense that these are the five big major powers outside the United States driving this. And they do represent real weight, right? They have a strong demographic contingent, they're strong military players, they all have big economies in some sense or the other, some bigger than others, but yes, they all have their own comparative advantages. But I think what is critical today is that the hard power in markets, and particularly China, which what China is doing, is that it's creating financial systems. China was part of the project Enbridge, which was led by the Bank of International Settlements on the integration of, settlement currencies between different currencies using both, central bank digital currency, which is based on a blockchain, and non-blockchain technology to settle currencies without using the US dollar, right? So completely moving the US dollar outside the system for intercurrency trade between different nations. So this kind of work and projects do make you understand or feel that there are alternative stacks being developed for potential use, and which could basically undermine the position of the US dollar as the central pin, linchpin of the global economy. The BRICS pay is somewhat modeled on that project Enbridge. That's what we've heard. And currency swap, RMB settlements, and other domestic economy-based bilateral agreements. For example, India and Russia have this ongoing engagement of using the Indian rupee or the Russian ruble for their oil purchase, etc. These are all trends that are undeniably, chipping away at the centrality of the USD. And I think as firms and as the global economy becomes more and more comfortable with non-US denominated trade, and with the US sort of retreating out of globalization, retreating out of major global treaties, and you see these minilaterals coming up between nations and bilateral agreements. I think firms and the corporate sector and the private sector will be using this as a leverage. They will have to accommodate and use the rupee or the RMB for their own business. And that will, one way or the other, replace the US dollar if not globally, but definitely regionally in trade and commerce, right? So I think that's where we are at the moment.
Yeah, again, I think that if there is quite a specific economic choke point, that's the dollar. And definitely countries are starting to realize that they need to diversify in order not to be targets of economic cohesion. And talking about the BRICS, on the BRICS platform, it used to be more of a political association, a political forum for these countries to talk. But lately, we are seeing how this is going in the direction of a more common economic agenda, and maybe a counterweight to the G7, and how the United States is trying to drift and drive economics in the global stage. If I can focus maybe specifically on the case of Brazil, because Brazil has also been one of the targets of the Trump's administration's rhetorics and economic cohesion targets. Brazil has, for the past years, tried to present itself as one of these global South leaders, and the president Lula trying to frame it from this global South perspective, trying to show that there can be development, there can be South-South cooperation. You can have a climate agenda, which I think has been really interesting. But something that's super relevant is how the U.S. administration has been trying to get involved, threatening Brazil with tariffs and sanctions because of this trial against its former president Bolsonaro that attempted a coup d'état, a regime change when Lula won the presidency a couple of years ago. The trial ended a couple days ago, a couple of weeks ago. Bolsonaro was convicted for attempting this coup. And despite of all these threats, this economic cohesion, Brazil really and stood its ground. I mean, it's true that based on the composition of the Brazilian economy, the sanctions were mostly going to hit those regions in the country that benefit politically Bolsonaro and that side of the political spectrum. But still, I mean, this low dependence on exports to the U.S. as well played a role. And I guess that just politically it helped as well this rally around the flag point. So Lula, I think that in general, I think he managed to stood his ground. I mean, more threats and more tariffs might come along. I mean, we have seen how Trump, Marco Rubio, they've said that more information will come in the coming weeks. So maybe we will see more economic cohesion threats. But I just thought it would be an interesting and really relevant example of how countries are trying to behave. And this is just one of these different powers.
So I think Brazil's an excellent case study, right? You mentioned we use the term agency. Brazil and Lula has been really, you know, hedging his bets. Engaging with the BRICS. Deepening right off the bat of the SCO. He called for an emergency BRICS meeting to speak to the leaders of India and Russia, China, South Africa, etc. on a lot of these tariff related topics, right? And I think what he's trying to do is be that bridge between the BRICS. Obviously, but within the BRICS, there's the RIC, right? The Russia, India, and China, which are the real big economies, and he's trying to kind of help navigate the challenges that exist between all three of them, because there are real world challenges between all three on security and other areas, and create consensus so that the global South, or at least the BRICS, are able to give one front voice against the United States behavior. So I think he's been really good on that. He's taken a lead on things like green transition, food security, industrial policy in general for Brazil. And, obviously he's also painted himself as this moral leader of the global South, this voice of the underserved. He did that in Brazil domestically, right? So I think he's just scaled that up on an international level now. And I think it's a classic middle power playbook of leveraging whatever you can from different parties and different sort of nations to get out most for your nation, right? India, on the other hand, I think is a little different because India is a larger economy, a larger nation as well, demographically, and definitely a civilized, how people in India consider India as not just a nation state, it's a civilizational state. And that means there's a degree of contiguity for people in India who feel, we've existed for 5,000 to 8,000 years, depending on which historian you want to go to. But, and America, for example, is 200-300 years old. So you'll see that logic come up in the national security domain, where a lot of national security folks in India see, or even geoeconomic folks, as as the United States being, its actions as a blip in time, that this will go away. So what India is doing right now is balancing autonomy and multipolarity. It's trying to use its leverage within the various different frameworks it has. With the US, with the European Union, and with partners like Japan, South Korea, Russia, and China, of course. It's also extending its own digital soft power. We spoke a little bit about DPI and things like that. What India has over, for example, a nation like Brazil right now is the ability to export a lot of its technology to the global South. So yes, Brazil has done brilliantly with its PIX payment system domestically, but has it been able to scale it across South America right now? Not really. Deepen its ability in, for example, in Africa, not so much. India, on the other hand, has extended its capability not only with Gulf nations like the UAE and then Singapore with its UPI rails, but it's also partnered up with big economies like France in the European Union to export a lot of its digital technologies. And what the mantra here is sovereignty, trust, inclusion, and giving nations an alternative model without the coercion of having to forcefully use a system that may not be of benefit for them, like how the US has traditionally done. And I think one more thing is that adaptively hedging against the United States unpredictability, right? So I think the US is getting more and more unpredictable, at least within the Trump administration, as long as it's here. For a lot of nations, it's about how do we survive for the next 3.5 years of his term as well. Because after this, there's no guarantee that the Republicans come to power. It could be the Democrats. But at the same time, it's about building your own country's national capability so that when this term ends and you do survive, you are able to renegotiate with the US on better terms and on a better footing potentially. And that's where India and Brazil, I think all of these nations are doing exactly that. Just the capacity of each nation is a little different.
No, it's a really interesting take, Yash, and I agree. I think that the Trump administration's latest behavior, I mean, it's totally making markets go all over. I mean, every week you have a new initiative, you have a new threat that might or might not happen. So I understand that all countries in this world of economic cohesion, they want some stability, and I think that is a card that China is trying to play. I think that in one of these latest summits we've had in the past month, that was one of Xi Jinping's strongest point. Like China must be that power of stability, and I think that is getting huge points throughout the global South that are trying to rely on partners that are reliable. And talking about these global coalitions or global alliances, I mean, lately you could totally see how India is trying to diversify, to pivot back again to Asia, to these Asian powers, which comes with opportunities, with challenges as well. I mean, it's true that India and China are still challengers in certain areas. There's tension that they still have in their border. There's the issue of Tibet. So, I mean, we might see some economic opportunities arise, but we still know that they are two geopolitical rivals in there. And then the case of Russia, it's also a challenge. I mean, it's true that the partnership with India is historic. It's been there forever. But lately, we've seen how Trump is trying to increase the pressure, and that it's not just with India. Lately, we have seen also Trump saying how the EU should also increase its sanctions towards Russia. But it's also quite paradoxical because Trump changes his perspective every now and then. I mean, you see him putting the red carpet for Putin in Alaska, and a couple weeks later, he says something different. So, to be honest, I feel that it might change again in the next week. So where is the policy? Like, where do you draw the lines in here? And countries are trying to find a way in there how to navigate the world of Trump, and that is really complicated. Even the EU leaders are trying to understand just how to behave. And I think that an interesting tendency that we're seeing as well is how now personal relations are super important, right? Like if the leader has a good relation with Trump, you might expect better terms. And it's interesting how to see all these leaders finding those person-to-person connections to be as important as the general economic or geoeconomic ties. But yeah, I mean, I think that New Delhi's calculation is evident. You gotta diversify. You're not part of any specific bloc, and that is it's geoeconomics, geopolitics 101.
I agree, Fabio. I mean, India's calculation is evident. It's reaching a point where accommodating China costs less than betting on Washington's assured support. But I wanted to ask you about the EU because it seems like it's torn in between all these changes, defending on the one hand a rules-based trade system while also adapting with stronger autonomy, deeper bond markets, and even exploring new trade arrangements with Asia. Brussels is now halfway through talks with India on a free trade agreement. As we mentioned, it is a sign that they want deeper economic ties beyond the Atlantic, but it means difficult compromises at the same time. So, Fabio, what is the point of view of Brussels from your perspective?
Well, as we were just saying, I mean, in this world of things changing every couple of weeks, the EU is trying to find a way forward, and if this rule-based order that the bloc has been trying to protect for the past decades is crumbling down, where does the EU stand? I mean, we've seen how leaders are trying to push for this stronger economic autonomy. The EU trying to rely less on other partners, like I think is the same narrative that we've said throughout the episode. But this is harder than it seems. I mean, we've mentioned how economics and national security are merging, are overlapping. So as much as you'd like to maybe diversify a little bit from the US, I mean, you still have the war in Ukraine next door. And who's one of your biggest partners, military partners in there? Well, that's the US as well. So I think that one of the facts why the EU-US trade deal happened like that is because even though you want to play a harder card there, you still need the US on your side on that topic. So that really limits this search for a strategic autonomy. But I mean, the EU is trying to build other partnerships. I mean, lately here in Brussels, we see more talks and a momentum forward with trade deals, not just with India, but as well with Mercosur, with Mexico. So you see how the EU is trying to open up a bit the possibilities. But I mean, it's undeniable that one of the main partners it is the US. So despite the fact that EU wants to open up, find new partners, that the US question will still be there. And as Yash has said, maybe the Republicans stay for another administration. Maybe there's a change, but the transatlantic marriage is having some issues, and I think that will be even harder and harder to address as time goes by. But the India-EU relation, I think it's super interesting as well. I mean, we're coming from the news last week that there's the talk of a trade agreement in the works. Still not completely in shape, but they want to reach a deal by the end of the year. So let's see if that happens. I mean, we saw a little of tension as well. There's this exercise in Belarus, this military exercise Russia did with Belarus last week, and there was some Indian presence as well that made it seem like things were not going to work as easy as they did. At the end, it was just a hiccup. I think things are still pushing forward. But I don't know, Yash, what's your perspective from the other side of the coin?
Sure. I think the India-EU relationship is really unique. It's unlike any of the relationships India has with other major, economic blocs or powers globally. I think where the EU really stands out is that it's a major economic and regulatory actor, right? It makes, it's good on governance. It's really important to the world on framing a lot of these issues around, emerging technologies, trade, etc. It plays an important role in that factor. But where the challenge lies is that the EU is not a geopolitical pole on its own, right? It's not a concerted geopolitical actor when it comes together. There are member nations all with their own interests and their own geopolitical security issues. For example, Poland doesn't see eye to eye with Germany on a lot of different issues. The concerns of the countries towards closer to the Ukraine is far more fundamental than those towards the West in Europe. So these things leave a challenge for a nation like India when dealing with the European Union, because where the challenge lies is what is your principle, is what a lot of the Indian trade deal makers or even geopolitical experts, diplomats, they're asking, what is your position on a lot of these different topics? And you don't get a centralized answer from the European partners that you have. Because again, like I said, very fragmented internally. The other issue is that, yes, the European Union and India do align ideologically. They're both democratic nations, both, largely adhere to democratic principles on many things. But there is this notion within the two where the ideologies differ, right? So, for example, let's say on human rights and things like that, there's a European perspective and then there's an Indian perspective. And there's always the ideology trumping over real world, realism of actually needing each other to, make deals and get the global, get these trade pacts moving. And, you'll always see that some kind of impediment comes in, from, either from the Indian side or from the European side, some announcement. Like very recently, there was this issue where the Swiss authorities, said something on human rights in India, and then India retorted, and that pushed back a lot of those negotiations that were happening, even though India and Switzerland have already negotiated an FTA bilaterally. But on the European level, that, pushed a few things back. I think where the opportunity lies is for the Europeans. India is the world's biggest market, right? It's 1.4 billion people, will be 1.6 by 2050. It's going to be the third largest economy in the next 2 to 3 years. It's one of the biggest markets that the Europeans can have. It is also India is also going to be an important leverage against China, against the influence of United States, and also a very strategic ally against its challenge of Russia, right? So using India to, you know, be to kind of manage those challenges is where the Europeans have to think pragmatically and go beyond the notion of ideology and things like that, and be a bit more, realist. Let's put it like that. And from the India side, I think the understanding that, the European system, I think there's still a lack of understanding in India on how the European Union really works, and the European Commission and the various different institutions that run different mechanisms in Brussels and outside of Brussels. So I think understanding that a little bit more deeply, one of the things that India has been trying to do is open more embassies, put more diplomatic staff in Europe to be able to understand how the whole system works, the bureaucratic architecture. And I'd say, this is maybe a little interesting fact that both nations are highly bureaucratic in nature, so that nothing happens quickly, right? And that's the challenge that you've seen between the two blocks really in their relationship.
Yes, that was very interesting, especially because I think that when we talk about how we're moving from ideological priorities and ideological alignment to more transactional relationships, we forget that ideology still plays a role, whether we like it or not. So this was a very interesting segue into talking about how, similarities in bureaucracy and different understandings of human rights and ideology will definitely still play a role at the negotiation table. With that, I think we are ready to move to block 3, where we will be talking about the world ahead and whether we see it as multipolar or fragmented. So we've looked at the fractured of the old economic order and the varied responses from countries like China, India, and Brazil. Now, the question becomes, where does this leave us today? Are we heading toward clearly defined blocs or a more fluid, fragmented global economy? Today's transformation isn't creating neat divisions. Instead, we're seeing overlapping relations, plurilateral relationships, and flexible arrangements that allow countries to maintain a strategic autonomy while navigating uncertainty. Will this lead to a world of fragmentation and economic warfare, or can powers realign to preserve stability in an age where every connection is also a vulnerability? Yash, in your view, is this new world moving towards a multipolar order where emerging powers shape new rules, or are we simply seeing fragmentation without any clear direction?
I think neither of the traditional labels really fit here, right? Like, we're not heading into this neat world of, the right versus the left and, how it was during the Cold War era, nor are we in a world of complete chaos. I think there's still structures and institutions and norms that are part and parcel, even though they're being attacked every day. Um, what this means operationally is that we're going to see a lot more regional level engagement, minilaterals on specific issues, So where are those issues, right? For example, let's think of issues that affect all of us. So technology governance, climate change, energy security. These things matter to all of us. It's not just about a nation's security, it's about the planet's security. So I think the human race itself. So I think these are where you're going to see a lot of alliances coming in. Good example of that is the International Solar Alliance, right? That's an alliance that was started by India on solar, the just transition towards solar energy and using that as a mechanism in moving away from fossil fuels. And most nations, regardless of their sort of thinking on on energy and fossil fuel dependence, etc., have mostly signed up to this agreement, right? For example, that's there. The second example has been the issue on AI, for example. Everyone realized that there is a benefit to AI and its impact on productivity and things like that, but there's a serious risk involved as well, and that requires governance structure. So you're seeing, even China saying that we need responsible AI and we need cooperation on this. Xi Jinping was particularly talking about this in the last year. So I think there's this notion, and I think where the world, in my opinion, is heading is that the emerging economies, their role, which was largely peripheral in the previous system, is changing, right? They're coming to the heart of the system. You're seeing Africa, the African continent, nations within Africa, India, etc. They don't want to be the victim of coercion and rules made far away in Washington and Brussels. They want to be part of the rule-making process themselves. So, they want to be architects of this new framework, new institutions. So we've touched upon AIIB, but, the other institution, the New Development Bank, based in Shanghai, which is, it's structure created out of the BRICS grouping. These kind of institutions which are providing development finance at very different sort of leverages and also very different ideological understandings will play a very important role for giving the capacity through capital and creating structures for these nations to create, to be a fundamentally more important player in these conversations, right? So I think that's what, in my opinion, the world is moving towards. And I think the polls, the big powers will dominate the headlines, but you'll see a lot more flexing of the muscles by the middle powers as well to kind of hone in on, these negotiations and these sort of conversations that are happening, and try to leverage and use their influence and be more influential than they were in the previous sort of world structure that we had.
Yeah, I agree. I think in similar lines, I mean, there will still be a hierarchy of global powers. I mean, as much more agency that countries such as Turkey, Indonesia, or Mexico might increase, I mean, you cannot compare against the economic leverage and power that players such as the EU, India, the US, or China might have. But it's true that this leverage and this influence might grow, and as more countries of this smaller or medium size start piling up together, that might uh, move the scale a bit to one side or the other. So in the case of fragmentation, I mean, maybe as you've said, Yash, it's not going to complete chaos, but I do feel like we are starting to see not parallel but different economies rising. I think that the sanctions that we've seen imposed on Russia these last few years have made other countries realize that they could be targets of similar sanctions in the future. So I totally see China trying to get away from being targeted by this in any case whatsoever. I mean, their agenda is clear. I think that in the medium to long term, they'll try to get a hold on Taiwan one way or another. So I think that the leadership in China is already starting to realize how can we avoid being targeted by this economic coercion in the coming years. And I think that these strategies are already starting to become things that leaders are thinking about. And also going back to sanctions, I mean, they are expensive. They are politically hard to impose, and we see that sometimes it's not even they don't have they don't create the changes in policy that they intend to. I think that in the cases that we've seen lately with Iran with its nuclear program, before the Russian war against Ukraine in 2022, I mean, there was a lot of threats from the U.S. on Putin, and that did not stop Putin to go into Ukraine. So maybe they do increase the pressure on countries, but they are not this silver bullet that policymakers say. So they will keep being part of the question, but I don't think that they are the one crucial thing that changes the way the world behaves. But definitely, minilaterals and more flexibility is still going to be the case. I think that maybe multipolarity and the world of international associations and forums is decreasing, but that doesn't mean that countries will stop talking to each other and cooperating with each other to achieve common agendas, even though they are not universal and they agree on everything else. I think countries will continue to be more pragmatic and more real in that sense, with a more realist angle. What about you, Valeria? How do you see this world we are heading into?
I completely agree with what both of you said. I see it as this concept of the club of flabs, where instead of having one big global framework as we used to, now we're seeing overlapping exclusive trade clubs where there's relations between Asia Pacific, then Latin America and the EU, but then there's also US, Mexico, Canada, India and the EU, as we were talking. So, and then dozens of bilateral free trade agreements as well. And I think the consequences of these are clear. There's fragmentation costs for business, for navigating multiple standards that will raise the cost for a lot of countries, and it will weaken global supply chains. There's power asymmetries for large economies. They would be using these clubs to set the rules and export their standards in a way that may not be as possible for other countries. But it also loses this concept of universality, which is the principle that may be sidelined in this process. But at the same time, as Yash said, it does open opportunities for smaller nations to find the way in a system that is not as defined and rooted in the way it's been for years. It definitely creates new opportunities. So I think it is about navigating that unpredictability and uncertainty. And whatever is happening today, we have no certainty that tomorrow will be the same. And it's about navigating that.
I agree, Valeria. I really like that concept of clubs of clubs. I think it's the first time that I hear it, but I'm definitely gonna implement it a bit more because I really like the way you put it there. We're living in really interesting times for sure, and as Yash has said, this is a transition towards even more changes coming up. So it's great to not just talk about them, but have three really different perspectives, three different voices from different countries and regions talking about this same world economy, which at the end, it's all interconnected one way or another. So things that happen in one side of the world will affect the other. And it's crucial to understand the different perspectives, right? I think that usually in these type of conversations, it's always the same actors and the same perspectives being reflected. So it's great that we have the chance to, see this panorama from three different angles. So Yash, thanks a lot for your time. Really, we appreciate it a lot. It was so insightful. I learned a lot. So a big hug straight to India from here.
Thank you, Fabio. Thank you, Valeria, for having me. And it's been, I've learned a lot from both of you and learned new perspectives as well. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Josh, for joining us. It's been a pleasure, and we've learned so much today. And thank you to all our listeners for listening to our podcast. And please leave any questions or comments, and like and share our episodes as you want.